Rachel apparently was unable to get back in here, so I need to start the recording. Okay, so now we've got this thing recording. We'll want to make sure that we can get this available for you guys afterwards as well, so that you can, so that you guys are able to view this at a later date. Okay, so some of the things, like I said, some new features. There are some things that became viewable inside of SharePoint 2010. So things like spark lines used to not render, some icon sets and data bars. Power Pivot name sets are now applicable inside of your web browser. There are some enhancements to the PivotTable that were that you can now use inside of SharePoint inside of 2010. I couldn't tell you exactly what those enhancements were as far as the PivotTable and that kind of stuff goes. I just know that they said that they made some enhancements on that kind of stuff, and if anybody wants some information on that, I can certainly dig up the actual behind-the-scenes stuff as to what's going on with that. Also in 2010, they added some interactivity within Excel services. So now you've got the option to use things like slicers, and we also have a new tool. I'm not sure if anybody's used this or not, but it's something called Power Pivot. And Power Pivot currently is an Excel plugin for available only in Excel 2010. And whenever you deploy those out to your SharePoint environment, which I can show you guys here in a little bit as well, whenever you do that, it's actually going to render that entire Power Pivot workbook as an Excel services page. So it'll actually show it to you right there inside the browser and allow you to interact with your Power Pivot workbook. Okay. There were also some improvements that were made inside of the Excel services actual service behind the scenes. Like I said, there were some things previously that would prevent workbooks from loading, and instead of doing that, there were things like cell comments, the formulas that would reference an external workbook. Those kind of things would actually cause your Excel workbook to crash. Whenever you would try to open it inside the web browser, you would just get a notice that says, hey, you can't actually view this, so it's not going to actually let you interact with it. One of those other things that would do that was VBA code. So if you had any VBA code in there, it would also cause the workbook not to render properly. And then things like clip art. So it didn't really it didn't enjoy having clip art inside your workbook. It wouldn't render all that stuff. So there are some things that are still unsupported, but now the workbook will render. So before, obviously all those things that I just mentioned there and the previously would prevent it from loading, those things have all been fixed, and it'll still load. There are some things though, however, like I said, that are still unsupported, but the workbook will render. It's not actually going to display them properly, so if you do have clip art in there, it's not going to show that. Cell comments not going to show it, but your workbook will actually load and let you see the things that are compatible. Okay. Now it just gives you a warning and says that there are some features that are unsupported whenever you try to load a workbook that has those. And this here is the nice little message that you get. So it'll come up with a little pop-up box that says, the workbook you selected cannot be loaded because it contains the following features that aren't supported by Excel services. And then, boom, 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 it'll list you everything that's inside of there that it won't actually support. You notice you do have the option to continue trying to open the file, and if you click yes, again, it just won't let you see those. It'll just render it without those objects inside of there. Okay. Some of the considerations before or during actually trying to set up your Excel services environment. You do need to have SharePoint 2010 Enterprise Edition. Excel Services is an enterprise-only feature. So that is one requirement. Unfortunately, there is a price tag that comes along with that, but it's a necessary evil if you want to be able to do a lot of the cool things inside of SharePoint. They do all require Enterprise Edition. On that same note, for SharePoint 2010, just an FYI, you do need to have SQL Server 2008 R2 as the backend for it. So whenever you install SharePoint, you need to have a 2008 R2 version of SQL Server. Regular 2008 will not work for the content databases, and also especially for having a Power Pivot instance installed. Okay. There is a service application that goes along with this, and that's really what's going to do all the heavy lifting in the background, which is one of the things that I really want to show you guys how to do today, because that's really the whole, that's really what drives this whole thing, is getting that service application set up. Okay. Excuse me. Data connections. There are some data connections that you're going to have to set up. You don't want to embed those inside your reports, and I'll kind of explain why whenever we get into actually building an Excel services report. I noticed there was a question over there about SQL Server 2011. Being that Denali is not technically released yet, it's still in the client technology preview stage, it's not recommended to put SharePoint over top of that. However, with SharePoint 2010 Service Pack 1, you can actually install it with Denali as the back end. The caveat to that, which we found out last week when actually trying to set up a VM that has Denali and SharePoint 2010 on it with no 2008 instance in there, it is a pain in the neck to get that installed because the installer that's inside Denali doesn't work currently to set up the SharePoint site. So it is possible. Definitely don't do that in a production situation currently, but that will be fixed going forward, and 2011, SQL Server 2011 should be able to be used as a full backend for SharePoint. Okay. Once you get your data connections, you're going to want to toss them into a data connection library, and we'll show you why that's important here in just a little bit as well. So what we need to do is actually tell Excel services that this library here, say library 1, is allowed to hold my data connections, however library 2 is not. And I'll show you guys how to set that up here inside the service application as well. Okay, trusted file locations, very similar to your trusted your data connection libraries. You do need to tell Excel, the Excel services web application, where my files are going to be located. So there's a couple of ways we can do that. Again, security implications come out on top of that, but I'll show you guys how to set it up so that you can either put those in any library inside your SharePoint site, or you can go in there and you can actually specify individual document libraries so that you don't have workbooks all over the place that people can just access. Okay, and finally we have the unattended service account. So if you've done any setup in SharePoint whatsoever, you will know that the unattended service account is very, very key to about 85 or 90% of the service applications. What that's going to do is allow us to have an alternate way to access the data in case we don't want to use the actual user's credentials. So if we want to be able to access a data source that through Excel that maybe my account doesn't have access to normally, I can't just go browse to it from SQL Server Management Studio, but I want to be able to show my end user the data that's behind it. I can actually give them a service account that has access to it without giving them directly access. And we'll talk about that here a little bit as well. All right, and demo time. So what we're going to do here, we'll start out, I'll put the slide up here again at the end in case you guys want to email me or if you have any questions after the webinar. But I'll kind of walk you guys through setting up a new Excel services application, and then we'll talk about how to create a workbook and do some of the deployment and that sort of thing. Okay, so first thing that we're going to want to do is access the central administration site. So if I type in here, server, okay. All the setup for your service application is going to be done through the SharePoint Central Administration, as well as all of your unattended service accounts and any other service applications that you happen to need to manage along the way with your SharePoint environment. Let me open up this VM here. Okay, everything's running. Actually, let's just go over here so we don't have to wait for this. So I have Central Administration open over here. If you aren't familiar with SharePoint Central Administration, if you're on the box, you can actually click on the Start menu, go to Programs, go to SharePoint 2010 Products, and then click on the Central Administration link. If you're not on the server, then you need to have a hosted version of the Central Administration site, and that's part of the setup of SharePoint. You'll give it a web application or an entry in IIS, and it'll actually give you a URL so you can actually access this from anywhere. So in this case, I'm going onto my virtual machine here, and I'm going to access port 26,000. And of course, it's not going to load over here because it doesn't like me right now. So inside of Central Administration, under the Application Management section, when you click on this, you're going to want to go into Manage Service Applications. And this is actually going to give you a list of every service application that you have on your SharePoint farm. This includes anything like Excel services, Performance Point. You'll notice I have there's my Performance Point service application, my Secure Store. We'll talk about that when we go into the Unattended Service account. And then we have things like Visio if you want to use Visio services, and other information that would be required for things like the Power Pivot service applications and stuff like that. So you'll notice I actually have a couple of Excel services applications in here, but if you don't have any in here, there's actually two ways to create this. The first way is going to be through this little screen right here, and what you'll do is click on New, and then click on Excel Services Application. If you don't have Excel Services Application, you need to check and make sure that you are in fact running the Enterprise Edition of SharePoint. So keep in mind, again, if you don't actually have Enterprise Edition, you're not going to see Excel Services on this list. Okay. When we click on New here, we'll give this a name. Let's call it Excel Services App. And then we need to pick a security or an application pool for it. More often than not, you're already going to have a application pool created that you want to run this. This is just going to be for the service application. It's the default account. You can see here the credentials will be used to load the web service. So anything like SQL Server has all kinds of services in the background that run it. Same thing with SharePoint, except for these are stored in a little bit different location. So choose yourself an application pool here that you want to do that. And then this button down here at the bottom, you can either check this or not. If you do check it, basically what it's going to do, let's say you have several different site collections on your in your SharePoint farm, and you want to, let's say you have 10 different web applications and a bunch of different site collections underneath those. So you want to add this to all of those by default. Rather than having to go in and associate them individually, if you check this option here, it'll add it to it automatically. And I'll show you guys why that's important once we get into setting this up. So we're going to click OK here. We're going to go through a little bit of processing. Hopefully it doesn't take too long here on my trusty little virtual machine. And as soon as we do that, you'll notice an extra entry is going to be inside of that list of web applications or service applications there that we have on and that's showing up there in the background. Excuse me. All right. Eventually this will load, I promise. At least we hope. If it doesn't, then we all get to go home early today. There it goes. All right. So here we have that Excel Services app. You notice it's the same thing that we just named it a minute ago, and it sits right there next to my other two Excel Services applications. So if we click on here, we're not quite done configuring this yet. So what we need to do is actually do a little bit of setting up on the actual service. So we talked about trusted file locations and trusted data connections. So whenever we create a data connection, we need to put it into a trusted library. If the library is not listed here, then SharePoint is not going to allow Excel services to use that connection. So I happen to have a SharePoint library on my Notepad document over here that I have a copy of. And I'm just going to paste it right inside of there. When I click OK, you're going to notice that the web address for it shows up right inside the list here. So if I browse to that same location, you'll notice I've actually got a couple of connections inside of that SharePoint library already. And in this case, it's just a Performance Point data source library. It'll hold any kind of data sources, ODCs, and all that kind of stuff. So you do need to list that here, however. If you do not list that here, SharePoint is not going to allow an external data connection. The purpose behind that is if you do you do put an ODC file out there, you need to use, and your SharePoint or your workbook is actually your Excel workbook, I'm sorry, is going to be looking at that location. It has to be listed here in order for the Excel workbook to be able to access it. Okay, so what we want to do is go back to Application Management, manage our service applications, and hop back into Excel Services app. Unfortunately, there's no simple way to go back without going. It'll take you back through that wizard, and I've had some issues with it kind of tossing out some of the settings that I've done. If you happen to know an easy way to go from that back through that wizard without going through Application Management and then back into Service Applications, by all means let me know, because I would be open to knowing that. Okay, so we talked about the Trusted Data Connection libraries. Now we know data connections have to go inside one of those libraries listed there. The next thing that we want to look at is the trusted file locations. And this is where I was talking about, if you don't want to have the entire site able to load Excel services workbooks, or you only want a portion of it to be able to, this is where you set all that up. So by default, whenever you set up your new application, you're going to have HTTP. And basically what this is going to do, you'll notice that there's an option in here for trusted children, and it says yes. So by default, every single file location is going to be allowed to store an Excel services workbook. If you don't want that, what you need to do is come into here, just click on either the link, or I believe you can actually click on the drop down here and say edit. It takes you to the same page, and you need to tell it that children are not trusted, or you need to just remove this entry in here altogether. So what we can do, if we come over to our SharePoint library and we open up Excel services here, we can take this URL minus the forms all items. So we just want the name of the library, which is just Excel services, and we can add a new trusted file location. All we'll do is paste it in there, tell it how we want this to be set up, say the location's an HTTP location. If we have folders inside of this, we can tell it to trust just those folders. So let's say that we came in here into our documents and we created a new folder and put a couple of workbooks inside of that, and we want to be able to use all those rather than having to go into that subfolder and copy and create a new entry in here. We need to say to trust the children. And really what that means is trust the children libraries and children file directories. Okay, so again, that's just optional. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. There's some other settings in here, some miscellaneous settings. The explanations on here are pretty good, so if you guys do have any questions about those, read through those, and if you have additional questions, please feel free to email me later about those. It's a lot of stuff around how long the Excel workbook takes to load and that sort of information. And then here we have things like maximum workbook size. So we say you're not going to load in browser a workbook that's over 10 megabytes, or you're not going to load a particular chart or image that's over 1 megabyte. So you have a little bit of control over what actually loads inside of the workbook. Okay, again, same kind of settings here for the calculation behaviors. And then we get down to something for the external data. And this section right here is really, really important. The reason this is important is because you have a couple of different ways that you can set up connections inside of Excel. The first being embedding the connection. So you can actually embed the connection string and tell it to only use that connection string that's inside there. The reason we don't want to do that, as I mentioned before, you want to try to you want to do external connections and put those into libraries as much as possible. And the reason for that is because let's say you have 30 different Excel workbooks out there on your site, and you have a server go down, or let's say you're doing server maintenance or doing an upgrade or something like that, and you want to switch all those workbooks over to use this new server. Or maybe you want to point them to QA for a weekend or something while you're doing some testing or anything like that. If you have all of your connections embedded inside of the workbook, you actually need to go in and update every single one of those workbooks. So you have to go in there and update 30 different connections inside 30 different workbooks. That is unbelievably time-consuming. The way you get around that, like I said, is making external connections, doing things like posting those ODC files out here, which I'll show you how to do that here in a little bit as well, and then telling the Excel services application that you want to be able to use trusted data connections as well as anything that's embedded. So the difference between these, let me just tell you guys real quick. If you were to choose none up here, which is the default setting, that means it's not going to allow any external data connections at all, whether they're embedded in the workbook or stored inside of a connection library. So what's in the workbook when you load it is what is the data that you have. You don't get any additional data. If you do trusted data connections and trusted data connection libraries only, it doesn't allow embedded data connections. The only external connections that are allowed have to be stored inside that trusted library, but it doesn't allow them to be embedded inside the workbook. And conversely to that one, very similar, you have to still store those data connections inside a trusted library, but you're also allowed to have them embedded inside of the workbook. This is generally, one of these two options are generally your best bet, since you do want to be able to refresh that data, but whichever choice you happen to need to go for inside your organization obviously is the one that you need to choose. Some warning information here, and then we get down to the bottom and everything's good. So I'm not going to actually add this location to my library here, but if we do that, it shows up here in this list again as just another location that we can choose. Okay, so once we have our trusted file locations set up, and that's very, very key because, like I said, if you don't have a data connection library in there, it's not going to let you load the data from it. Same exact way with your trusted file locations. If your workbook is not in one of those trusted file locations, you're not going to be able to load a workbook inside the browser. Okay, and the final thing that we're going to look at here is the global settings. So we've got a couple of options in here. The key one that you're going to want to look at is going to be all the way down here at the bottom, and it's called the application ID for the unattended service account. So you notice we have an unattended service account here, and this is going to be the account that workbooks use for their data refresh. If you, inside of your workbook, whenever you're creating the data connection, if you choose the none option, which is different from the one I just showed you. We'll look at this other one here in just a minute. But if you choose none, all the authentication is going to be running through this application ID right here. So let me show you guys just real quick how to set that up in case you're unfamiliar with that, and then we'll come back in here and kind of finish up on the web application side. The unattended service account is something that's going to be stored inside the secure store. So if we come into managed service applications again, you notice as we scroll down here we have a secure store service. When you click on that, it's going to open up another configuration screen for this. So I have an actual unattended service account in here already created, but if you don't have anything in here already, if it's the first time that you come in, you're going to need to generate a new key, and then you can start creating service accounts. So it's a real simple process. All you do is click New, and the real thing that we want to show you here is, let me just see if I can get to it real quick. The real purpose of this is going to be whenever you go to fill out this screen right here. So you tell it what you want to put in. You want a Windows username and password, and then you can actually map users to it. So you have to be a member of this section right here in order to be able to use it. So I'd have to insert my account here inside of here. And then what that's going to do is you'll notice I have the option to set the credentials on here. So basically what's going to happen is whenever we see none on the ODC connection file, it's going to come into here. It's going to use the account username and password that I input inside of the screen and use that to go access the database. So this account right here needs to be some needs to be some sort of an account that has access to whatever data sources you're going to be using inside of your Excel workbooks, be that a database, be it an analysis services cube, any file system locations. I mean, whatever the workbook needs to access, this account that you insert right here needs to have access to that. Otherwise, your workbooks aren't going to load. Okay, so keep in mind, always take the exact name of this right here. So we want to take unattended service. Keep that in mind. So when we come back over to that screen that we talked about inside of our Excel services application, then global settings, all the way at the bottom, you're going to type in unattended service right here. Okay, you're going to do that, and you're going to click OK. Unfortunately, there's no validation on that. It doesn't go back and check in the secure store. So I could go in there and type in Death Star, and it would absolutely let me go forward. I can go in there and type in Millennium Falcon, and it'll still go forward. It doesn't validate that whatsoever. It's just going to fail whenever you try to run it because it's not going to be able to find that application in the secure store. And that name does have to match exactly. Okay, so let me see here. Did I put? Okay, so we have our data connection library in there. We have our file locations, and we set up our unattended service account. So at this point, we're pretty much ready to go and actually deploy a workbook. But I do want to show you guys one other way that you can actually set up the Excel services stuff. So if we come into central administration here, rather than going into application management and then clicking new up at the top and doing all that stuff, there's a couple of configuration wizards built in. So you can either access from the main screen central administration by clicking configuration wizards, or you can click on the left-hand side over here and get to it as well. When you do, you're going to get this little icon here, and it's going to ask you to launch the farm configuration wizard. When you click on Start Wizard over here, you'll notice that I've got a list of a bunch of different applications, and everything that I've already got set up is already grayed out. The reason that everything's grayed out is because I've already configured all these manually. So anything that's not configured already, like this Lotus Notes connector, all I'd have to do is put a checkbox next to it, click Next, and it's going to run me through some stuff to create the service accounts and all that kind of information, and then it's going to actually show up inside of that application management list that we were just looking at. So we don't actually want to do this. We'll uncheck that for now, but this is just another way to set that up. So if you don't see an Excel Services application on the application management list, then you can come in here and do it this way as well. So it's just a little bit of a more friendly user interface for you to use. Okay, so in the end, what you're going to end up with is something like this. So notice we're right inside of my regular SharePoint library here. And when I click on this Excel Services sample workbook, this is actually one that Microsoft has created. You'll notice that we get a full Excel workbook in here. I can use these filters up here at the top, and as soon as I do that, all my data refreshes. So the question is, how do we build something like this, and how do we actually let our application use it? And let me go back here real quick. Sorry to keep jumping around on you guys like this. I just remember something that's pretty important here. Whenever we set up the Excel Services web application, I mentioned that there was a checkbox down there for automatically adding this to your existing site collections. So what you can do, what that does for us here, this Configure Service Applications Association, this is another very key step in enabling your application to be able to use it. So you notice I only have one web application on here, which is my default port 80 site. And you'll notice on my application proxies over here, I have a giant list. And a couple of the things on there, since we checked that box, is this Excel Services application. If that's not listed there, or you forget to check that box, what you need to do is click on Default here. And then you're going to get a little list of, it's the same exact list that's over here. It's just, if we come in here, we can do things like uncheck the service application there. And when we click OK, you'll notice that the Excel Services application disappears off of our list. So you can change all that kind of stuff inside of this screen here. So if you do have any issues getting Excel workbooks to load, if it's not even trying to render them inside the browser, this is definitely one of the places that you need to come and check. This is usually the first place that I go and check, because sometimes if you do like site restores or something like that, and the service account is called something different, it won't come in, so you'll have to actually come in and reset up those associations. But once you do, you'll get a very nice user interface. You'll notice everything that we have here looks like we're just same exact thing that you get inside of Excel. The only thing that you don't have inside of here that we don't have the option to do is maybe to drag over some new fields. So we don't have, even if we scroll all the way over here, we don't have our pivot table field list over here that we can use. You do have some information here that you can mess with at the top. You can go and find pieces of data inside your workbook. You can do a data refresh or recalculate everything inside the workbook. And then, of course, you have the old trusty option to open this inside Excel. So you have that option there as well. Same thing as inside Excel, you also have the option to go and view your other workbooks. So you can view any other pages inside your workbook, should I say. So we can come in here and do the same stuff that you would do inside of Excel and sort your list, do all the same kind of interactions that you would get from a normal workbook. Okay. So let's talk about how to actually create something like that. So we have a couple of things that we need. Like I said, we need to have a library to store our workbooks in, and then we have this data connections library over here that's going to be the location where we're going to store our data connections at. So what we'll do is come over here to our workbook. We have just a blank workbook open here in Excel. What we're going to do is click on Data up at the top, and we're going to do a new data source from Analysis Services. And I'll go ahead and just do localhost, click Next, and it's going to go ahead and go out to my local server. It's going to pull in all the Analysis Services databases. In our case, we want to go ahead and use the AdventureWorks here. We'll click on Next, and you can name the file. You'll notice something that's going to be not so good, and this is why one of the ways that we get to use those ODC files. So it's actually creating an ODC file here for us, but you'll notice that it's actually going to my C drive. So it's going to go to my C, users, BShack, documents, data sources. Problem with that is if I deploy this workbook to SharePoint right now, nobody else is going to have access to my documents folder on my computer, especially if my computer is turned off. They're not going to be able to access this, and therefore they're not going to be able to get any data refreshed inside the workbook. So I'll go ahead and overwrite the file that I've got there, and we'll just do a pivot chart table. Toss those out there, and here we go. So we'll go ahead and drag our chart down there at the bottom for now, and let's say that we want to build a report off of, say, internet sales. Okay, so we'll just start building a report just like you normally would. We're not going to go over too much stuff here inside of Excel just because this isn't really an Excel webinar. This is just trying to show you guys some stuff in SharePoint side of things. So let's take something like customer geography and see what that does for us. So now we've got a breakdown of each of the geographies, and we have a nice little chart to go with it. Let's actually toss it up there on the top so we can group this a little bit differently. And then let's go into our date, and let's see if we can, let's do this by calendar year. So we've got two different things in here. We have a chart and we have a pivot table. And let's go ahead and let's toss in some slicers also, just to show you guys that slicers do in fact work. So we'll go over here to customer geography, and we'll do a slicer for country. So what we get now is we can expand something like Australia, and you'll notice our chart down here at the bottom updates on its own. Or we can come over here and we can slice it by country and say we only want to look at Australia, or maybe just Canada and France. But notice that we do have full use of both the slicers, and the pivot table is updating our chart down here at the bottom and all that kind of good stuff. So what we'll do is we'll rename this country, and we'll rename this over here to years. Okay, so everything's still working, and now we're ready to put this out to SharePoint. So first step whenever you get ready to deploy a workbook out to SharePoint is to go over to your Data tab and click on Connections. And the reason that we need to do this is because we said that that connection file was going to be stored just on my local computer. So we need to actually put that onto SharePoint. So from here, we'll select the connection that we want, click on Properties, and then go to the Definition tab. Okay. Inside the Definition tab, this just further supports what I was saying there, you know, that's stored inside that Documents folder. And we want to actually put that out to SharePoint. So if we already have a connection file in SharePoint, we can browse to it and do that. Or we can come over here and do Export Connection File. Let's go ahead and check the box here next to Always Use Connection File, because we always wanted to be able to use that rather than having to use the embedded connection string here. This way, again, in case we do any updates to that, then we will actually be able to use the new connection file that we just uploaded. The other thing that we have here is these Excel services authentication settings. And this is that none option that I was telling you guys about a little bit ago. So if we select none here, it's going to always use the secure store service account. And again, if we put in, if we don't put in the right secure store service into that application setting, it's not going to work. So that's why getting that put in there is so key. Okay. The other thing that we can do is actually specify a particular secure store and use that. Or the other thing we can do is use Windows authentication. So we'll go ahead and just keep it on Windows Auth for right now, and we'll export our connection file. Okay. Alrighty. So here you'll notice again that we're just browsing on my computer. I'll go ahead and see if I can get this to go. Server. Actually, I think I still have the connection library. SharePoint PI. So we'll browse over to my SharePoint site here, Hopefully it loads inside of Excel, even though it didn't want to load over there inside of Internet Explorer for me. Looks like we do have a question over here. It says, did you say the pivot table field wasn't available in Excel services when opening a workbook that was originally created outside of Excel services? Yeah, all of your workbooks are actually going to be created inside of Excel. And then the pivot table field list, though, that's over here on the right-hand side that you can see behind me here, this is not going to be available inside of the Excel services window. It's available inside of Excel whenever you create it, but once you deploy it, you don't get the option to drag over more fields and do that kind of stuff. If you want to be able to do any more slicing, you have to pre-build those on the rows or columns and then deploy it out to SharePoint that way. Okay, so we'll go over here. We said that we wanted to put this into our data connections library here. And once we open that, we'll give this a little bit more friendly name, and we'll just call it Cube. Okay, and when we click Save here, we're going to get an extra little dialog box that's going to come up. So we're almost done deploying our data connection out to our data connection library. You notice here in the background, you can see it's going out to that location. It's actually putting the file out there right now. Let's go ahead and just show you guys here. This is the data connection library currently. And whenever I come over here, the content type is going to be an ODC, an Office Data Connection file. So you always need to choose that from your drop-down list there whenever you save this outside of Excel. So always choose Office Data Connection file, click OK. You'll see here, saving as cube.odc. And as soon as that gets done doing its business there, we'll come over here to our SharePoint library and see if it's out here already. So there's that cube file that we just created and exported is now inside of our Office Data Connections, our data connection library here. The other thing you'll notice is this connection file location right here switched from my C drive out to the SharePoint share. So now, instead of pointing to my C drive, whenever we save this file, this workbook out, we'll actually be looking at the SharePoint site. Okay. So now when we click OK and click Close, what we can do is come up here, we'll say File, Save and Send, and we want to save it to SharePoint. You can either choose a recent location, or you can do Save As or Browse for locations. If you can see that on my screen there in the little tooltip that popped up, this is actually going to that Excel services library, which I will show you guys here real quick. So we don't have any, we have these 3 workbooks in here right now. And once we do this, we'll say that we want to save it over to that location. We're going to get a little pop-up box here asking us what we want to name the file. And then from there, we'll be able to actually push it out to SharePoint. So as soon as this comes up here, notice those 3 workbooks that are already out there. We will call this one, let's call this sales by country. You do have the option to go ahead and deploy it and open it inside the browser. We won't check that for now just because I'll show you guys how to open this stuff here. And we'll click Save. Okay. Now, whenever we do that, if we go back over to SharePoint here and we refresh this list, you'll notice we have that new workbook called Sales by Country. And when we click on that, we get the same interface that we just had inside of Excel. Again, everything except for our pivot table list, field list over there on the right-hand side. So you can see that's the one that we currently have. And this is the one that we were just messing with. So everything inside of here is the exact same. We're just missing this pivot field table list. So what we can do is we can start drilling through this kind of stuff. And again, notice that our chart down here at the bottom changes. Maybe we only want to look at a couple of countries. All of our slicers are working. Looks like everything in here is good to go. So we can filter up here by country as well. Maybe we only want to look at a couple of states or something like that. So you can actually do the regular Excel filters are also available, but you do have the option to choose your slicers over here as well. So if we just want to look at Australia, again, we can drill down even further. It's not really a whole lot of useful information that you can see on that chart there, but it is an option to keep drilling down as much as you want. So the real advantage of Excel services is going to be able to create these nice canned reports for your end users and have them just be able to go out to SharePoint, click on the link, and actually open it up inside their browser. One of the great things about this is I don't even have to have Excel 2010 on my computer. So even though this report was created in Excel 2010 and uses slicers and uses all kinds of cool stuff, I don't actually need to have that on my computer. I can have no version of Office whatsoever on my computer and still be able to open this report and mess with it all I want. Opening in Excel is going to be a little bit of a problem, obviously, if I don't have 2010, but at least I can actually view it inside the browser and see the kind of data that my whoever built the report wants me to be able to see. Okay, you do have some other options here. You can download a snapshot, so it'll actually save the data with it, or you can download a copy and it'll give you the copy of this exact same workbook. Reloading the workbook will take, let's say we have a couple of filters on here, so we can do a reload workbook, say yes, and it'll actually clear any formatting or anything like that we've done. So if we're drilled down into here, you know, through if we really jack this report up, and so if you look at it the way it is right now, if we go back to the Excel services and come back in here, it's going to appear the exact same way as it was before. But what we can do is just click on that reload workbook, say yes, and it'll reset it to exactly where we were. Okay. Your other options up here to refresh the data connections, as I mentioned, and you can refresh any of the whatever you have highlighted is going to refresh that particular connection. So if we have a different connection that actually runs our table here, you can refresh just that by selecting the table and then doing it. Okay. One other quick thing I want to be able to show you guys here before we finish up is actually using Excel services to embed this stuff into a dashboard. So there's a couple of ways that we can do this. There's a real simple way. What you can do is come into Site Actions, do More Options over here on the left-hand side. It's going to give you a nice little window that you can choose all kinds of different stuff to use. And what we're going to say is we want a web part page. Okay, and when we choose the web part page, when we create this here, we've got a couple of different options how we want to do this. We'll just say Excel services, and we'll say that we want this to go into our Excel services library. So we'll just toss it into there for now. And when we create this, we have a nice little web part page that we can do. What you can do is say over here, add web parts, and you can also go up to Insert and do web part here. Excuse me. And under Business Data, you have this Excel Web Access option. So when we click that there, you notice we can tell it where we want to add it to. We'll add it to the left column. We'll say Add, and then you get a little screen here. Click to open the tool pane, and you can actually embed a workbook in here this way. One of the key things to remember is what we'll do here is we'll go ahead and just pick that workbook that we just created. Where was it? Excel Services and Sales by Country. Okay, so we'll use that workbook. It wants you to have a named item. So what you would think is, okay, I'll just click on the little ellipsis here and I'll be able to pick from a list of items. That's unfortunately not the case. So what you have to do is actually look over here inside of Excel, and when you select something, like we select our chart here, you notice up here in the corner that it actually tells us the name of the chart. Or if we right-click on our pivot table and do pivot table options, you'll see our pivot table is named pivot table 1. So let's say that we just want to get this pivot table, or maybe just our chart, out onto our Excel workbook, or onto our web part page here. We'll take here, and we'll right-click on this. Well, let me right-click. Okay, so I'm just going to do Control-C to copy it. So I'm copying the name of the object, which is chart 1, and I'm just going to paste it right into there. Or you can type it in if you happen to know the name of it. This is why keeping track of those and naming your different objects is a pretty key thing that you need to do. So we'll name that chart 1. We'll click OK, and you'll notice that we get chart 1 in here. There's a ton of options of things that you can do here. You can either display a toolbar, the full toolbar, or no toolbar. this is going to give you the same kind of things that we saw over in the Excel services page, where it gave us file up here at the top right, and then refresh data sources and all that kind of stuff. And then from there, you can further limit what you see. So if you don't want people to be able to download your workbook, just uncheck that option. If you don't want to be able to recalculate the workbook, uncheck that. And we'll scroll down here at the bottom. Some other things that you can do, you can change the title of it. So we'll call this Sales by Country. And do you want to limit the height of the workbook? No, we'll allow it to expand as it wants. So there's all kinds of different stuff that you can do in here. There's a ton of settings that I really don't have time to go through, but there's a lot of good stuff inside of there. So now when we click OK, you'll notice that inside of there we have that we have our chart. So if we come over here and we go to our Excel Services library, and we click on that Excel Services thing that we just created, here's that web part page, fully functional, that we just created using that little web designer there. And this is another one of those things that you can hide the view option here. You can actually switch between the different objects inside. You'll notice that we don't actually have use of the slicers right now. And the other thing is that we also need to be able to link this workbook, maybe link the charts and the slicers and all that kind of stuff. You want to be able to link all those together. There is a way to do that. It's not something that, again, that we really have time to go over here in the next 3 minutes, but there is a way to do that. All you have to do is, what you're going to actually want to do, rather, is come over here to our site, and you're going to want to create a performance point dashboard. And inside of our library here, what you'll do is create new, and then say performance point dashboard. Oh, actually, I need to do this from my computer. I can't do it from there, from the VM. Let me see if this will work real quick. Performance point dashboards are a great way to bring a lot of different technologies together. Performance point itself is really cool. You can create like charts and graphs and that kind of stuff. But if you do want to be able to import outside data, what you can do is create a report that's based off of the Excel services, or the Excel report that I just tossed out there. So right here we have the dashboard designer. And what you would do is come up here and say create, and you want to create other reports. Under other reports, you have an Excel services option. And you'll notice a little synopsis down here. It says that you can create a report out of an existing Excel services workbook, but this does also require you have Excel services installed. So even though it's using Excel server or using Performance Point, it's going to be using Excel services in the background to actually display that. And whenever we do that, you'll get the option here, where is it located, what document library, the name of the workbook, and the name of the item on the workbook that you actually want to display. So you've got a lot of different options that you can do in here as far as that goes. And then the one final thing that I want to show you guys, since we are out of time here, is Power Pivot. So we mentioned Power Pivot a little bit earlier. Power Pivot workbooks are pretty cool stuff. You can, it's basically kind of like building a cube just inside of Excel. If you haven't actually used Power Pivot, it's a free add-in for Excel. So we have this right here is a Power Pivot workbook that I have. You notice the data is all inside of here. I've got all my orders. This is a report that I built off of that. And the reason I want to show you guys this real quick, not to sell you guys on using Power Pivot, but just let you know that the Power Pivot workbook, whenever you open that, actually is rendered with Excel services. So Excel services is required to be installed on the server in order to display your Power Pivot workbooks out there on your SharePoint site. So I know there's a lot of questions out there on the question panel. What I'll do, since we don't really have time right now, and I'm actually getting ready to head out the door here in a few minutes to hop on a plane to go to Atlanta, I'm going to see if I can copy all those questions out of there, and I'll see if I can get those emailed back to you guys with some answers. There's a lot of good questions out there.
I can email you a report, Raj.
Please do that. That would be lovely.
Do that.
So here's my contact information again. If you guys want to contact me, if you happen to toss a question out there and just to be sure that it gets answered, by all means, please feel free to email it over to me, and I'll definitely get back to you guys on that. I definitely want to be able to help out wherever I can as far as getting those questions answered for you. So there's my blog. It's the same content on both of those as well as on SQL Server Central. And then if you guys want to follow me on Twitter, there's my Twitter address as well.
Okay, great presentation, Brad. I actually think I could do a SharePoint demo now.
I'm going to hold you to that.
What? All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Brad. And once again, you can view this. It has been recorded, and it will be made available on our website under past webinars by the end of the week. Everyone,
awesome.
Have a great week.
Thank you guys for coming.
The organizer has ended the session.